Dear brothers and sisters in the Sangha, no translation, Namo Buddhaya. So I arrived back from India just 2 days ago, and before I set out, I was at our Bordharan retreat centre in the jungle near Nagpur, and I was attending a meeting of the Three Strands, the Indian Three Strands. There were 82 men and women, dhammacharis, dhammacharinis, who were all, as you are, mitra conveners, order conveners, etc. Dhammarati already enumerated sufficiently. So at the end of the meeting, they wanted to, celebrate the dedication of Adhisthana. In fact, on the 3rd of August itself, they wanted to celebrate the dedication of Adhisthana. So we did a dedication simultaneously with the dedication going on here. Dhammacharini Vijaya led the dedication ceremony in Hindi, and we had a projection onto a big screen behind her of Adhisthana from the field beyond in the snow. It looked magnificent. And I taught then about Adhisthana, about the meaning of the word Adhisthana, and it seemed to make a very big impression on people. I'll tell you more about that in a bit. But first of all, I have a duty to perform. One of the hazards of coming back to England from India is that as you're about to step on the gangway to the plane, things are piled upon you. I remember once literally getting into the car to go to the airport, and somebody brought to me a huge clay elephant. It was that big, no, not exaggerating. And of course, you can't just sort of say, no, not now. You have to bring it in the car with you and find something to do with it on the way. I won't tell you what happened. But yes, I got various things heaped upon me, all of which unbalanced my very careful measuring of the weight of my luggage. But I was asked by the United Three Strands of India to bring a Buddha Murti, Rupa, to Adhisthana. And so what I'd like to do now is to hand it over to, I think, Ratnadharani, the project director. So this from the Three Strands. It's not. It's what it is. It's more than 4 inches. So yes, the term Adhisthana for people in India has very, very rich connotations. People were so pleased when they heard that this place was to be called Adhisthana. It's a term that's current in Indian culture, especially, of course, Hindu culture. But it seems to have extremely positive connotations, and it doesn't seem to be something that Buddhists react to. They find so much of Hindu terminology really repellent. They don't seem to find this repellent. I don't know why. And for them, as soon as they heard the word Adhisthana, people sort of started smiling and with delight. They have a vivid sense of that sort of connection with something beyond themselves. Myself, I heard the term first in this connection sometime around the beginning of the year. Bhante told me that this is what he was thinking of calling the place, and I immediately thought, what a wonderful name. But I then did a bit of research and looked into it, and I thought this is extraordinarily significant that Bhante's called this place Adhisthana. So I want to explore that a little bit and then begin to look at themes that arise from that are really relevant to us all as holders of responsibility within our order and movement. So Adhisthana, as probably you all know, I'm not going to go into the etymology of it, but it effectively means the power emanating from the Buddha and other great spiritual beings, bodhisattvas, great gurus, and so forth. It means the kind of the influence that they have, the tangible influence that comes from their presence. The locus classicus for that, perhaps, is the first meeting of the Buddha with his former companions in Shravasti. You remember the Buddha came from Bodh Gaya, having attained liberation, seeking to teach what he'd learned. And he'd realized that his 5 former, not disciples, his 5 former companions were ripe. So he went to the deer park at Shravasti. They were all sitting down together. And the story is that they saw him coming in the distance, and they agreed amongst them that they would ignore him because he had rejected the true life. He'd rejected the true spiritual life. He'd turned away from ascetic practice. He'd taken food, obviously a weakling. And yes, they decided amongst them that they would remain seated. They would not make a place for him. They would not offer him water, and so on. I'm beginning to embellish a little, but poetic license is, I think, legitimate. So as the Buddha came towards them, they found themselves willy-nilly unable to maintain their determination. They found themselves rising to their feet, going to him, saluting him, making a place ready for him, making him welcome. They couldn't help it. That was the Buddha's Adhisthana. The Buddha had a presence, a sort of a force that was its own argument. He needed to say nothing, he needed to do nothing, he just walked towards them. And his presence was so overwhelming, you might say, that their very proud, egoistic sort of determination just melted, and they found themselves honouring him, revering him. That to me is the essence of Adhisthana. It's the presence that great individuals carry. It's not charisma in the ordinary sense. It's not rock star charisma. It's often associated, indeed, with somewhat unprepossessing physical presence. I remember Bhante talking about Dudjom Rinpoche when he first saw him and describing this rather slight figure doing a puja. Bhante himself, as a physical presence, is not particularly striking. I remember when my mother first met him, she wasn't at all impressed. And that's a pretty good gauge. So it's not charisma. It's not also authority or status. You know, you can feel quite awed by people who carry high position. If you met the Queen, for all your republicanism, you might find yourself, rather awed. If you met the Prime Minister or the President or whatever you might think of them, you'd find yourself probably quite awed. But it's not like that. It's not that sort of overwhelming in the ordinary ego sense, one ego being larger than another. It's something altogether more than that, beyond that. It's an influence coming from, well, in a way, beyond the person themselves. So it's a force field that somebody of real Dhammic attainment spreads around them, that if you're at all awake, you cannot but respond to. It's, yes, it's impressive in that way. I mean, in the sense that it overwhelms your defences and opens you up so that you cannot but respond. But it also has a connotation of sustaining. Adhisthana sustains you. if you are in tune with that Adhisthana coming from these great beings, you're sustained by it, you're uplifted by it. I think immediately of the Ratnaguna Samchayagata, was that subheading that is delightful to my ears, the source of Subhuti's authority. In all modesty, I have to say it's nothing to do with me. But you remember what the source of Subhuti's authority is. It's not actually stated in the text. This is Konza's own gloss taken from other sources. But what the text says is that whatever the Buddhist disciples know and adroitly explain, they do so not by their own power, but by the might of the Buddha. They've learned it, they've practiced it, they've realized it, but they teach it by the Buddha's might. In other words, their teaching, their practice in the active sense, their activity is sustained by the power of the Buddha. So, Bhante's given this place that name. It's quite something. And of course, what one can't help but think of is Bhante's own Adhisthana, which I certainly have experienced, and experienced very strongly. I've certainly myself been overwhelmed at times by Bhante's Adhisthana coming through Bhante. I can think of so many occasions when I've gone to Bhante, well, for instance, with many questions in my mind, even perhaps critical questions or whatever, and simply to go into the room with Bhante is to find the questions answered. Well, not even answered, they're just dissolved, they just disappear, because Bhante is the answer. His presence, his mode of existence is the answer. It's very interesting seeing him now, because he's not at all well. And, sleeplessness has really beaten him down. But that presence is still there. That Adhisthana is still there. It's something that it comes through him, that works through him ineluctably. And it has a sustaining power for me. I've never actually chosen to take any responsibilities in the order and movement. I've always been asked to do so, mainly by Bhante. I've never thought of myself as especially capable or worthy or anything like that. I've got my prides. I don't want to sort of appear humble or over-humble or falsely humble, but I'm not inclined to think of myself as taking up a position or responsibility. I prefer to have it given to me. And usually it's been Bhante that's given it to me, and I've felt I've been able to carry it out because of his Adhisthana. And there have been moments when that's all that's carried me through. I remember in 1985, Bhante, sneaky fellow, was trying to solve the problem of how to hand ordinations on. And he was going to India and to conduct ordinations, but his mother was quite ill and very nervous about him going. So he said that he couldn't go, and he asked Kamalashila, myself, and Suvadra to go in his place. I've never actually talked to Kamalashila about it, but I for one was, to say frightened wouldn't be quite the right word. I just felt completely inadequate to what I was being sent to do. My own ordination was and still is the key experience of my life. Nothing since has been more significant. It's absolutely the linchpin of my life. And the fact that Bhante conducted that ordination was extraordinarily important to me. A very striking experience going into the private ordination room, and there's this tremendous presence there which didn't seem to be Bhante. A quite odd experience. Anyway, that was my experience of a private ordination. And now I was going to be doing that for somebody else. It's just absurd. Completely unreal. For people who I really didn't know much about them. I didn't know their culture. I didn't know their language. The first person I ordained spoke no English at all, and I certainly spoke no Marathi. And I remember sitting in the little hut that Jyotipala built in the grounds at Bhaja Retreat Centre, and it's just the thought literally coming through my mind, what on earth are you doing here? Where's the escape route? Where's the ripcord? Is that the right word? The ejection seat, that sort of thing. But there wasn't one. And I remember the thought just came into my mind, okay, Bhante, you sent me here, you do it. And I just carried through the whole thing just with the feeling that, well, sort of Bhante was doing it, as it were, through me. I, as me, were completely inadequate to it. I'm still inadequate to it. But Bhante, as it were, working through me, can do it. His Adhisthana can sustain me. And I think at my best, I work like that. I'm working like that at my best. I'm not always at my best, and sometimes it's something else, but we won't go there. So Adhisthana is this sustaining power that enables us to give something that comes from more than us. And of course, others may experience things quite differently. My experience is very particular. Others may feel even uncomfortable with the language that I'm using. I'm just telling you what I feel and see and experience. Others may experience it differently. But for me, it's quite important to acknowledge that, this sense of Adhisthana, a sustaining power, something that I'm opening up to, and that I'm deliberately through Buddhanushmriti practice, whether in the form of bodhisattva visualization or Buddha visualization or other kinds of Buddhanushmriti. I put all of those under the heading of Buddhanushmriti. But that's a way of connecting with the Adhisthana of the Buddha. This sustaining power, this force or influence that carries you beyond yourself. And that has, in Bhante's own words, founded the order through him. Bhante referred to it, you remember, I've mentioned in my last paper, he refers to it as a suprapersonal force or energy working through him. He says he did not found the order by himself alone. It was founded through him by what he can only describe as a suprapersonal force or energy. So another way of saying that is the Adhisthana, perhaps from the Buddha, perhaps from the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas upon whom Bhante was meditating, perhaps from something more difficult to pin down, something more inchoate, less clearly definable, decipherable. But Bhante felt that force, that sustaining power working through him. You remember the description that I quoted of Bhante giving so many talks in Nagpur in 1956 on hearing the news of Dr. Ambedkar's death and feeling that he was not a person but an impersonal force. He said later, suprapersonal would have been a better way of putting it. But he was sustained by something which was not to do with him. And I think that our order, at its best, is functioning on that Adhisthana, which comes to us in the first place from Bhante. Bhante sort of focuses the Adhisthana for us and transmits it to us so that we are powerfully affected by it and are able to function on its basis. I felt this so strongly very early on in my own contact with with the movement, which went with Bhante, basically. Bhante was the movement. Le mouvement, c'est moi. There are a number of occasions when Bhante taught the Dhamma, maybe in a seminar, maybe in a lecture, when I saw the truth. I saw it directly. I saw it absolutely clearly, inescapably, and I've never escaped from it. I've done my best, but I've never managed, really. I always come back to it. For me, that experience of transcendence has come through my contact with Bhante. I'm not saying anything about degree of transcendence. I think that's rude. But yes, a strong sense of something that goes completely beyond us as individuals, as personalities, and that in a way makes so much of what we are as personalities rather ridiculous, or at least you know, to be looked at with a sort of humorous, gentle acceptance, but which is really quite transcended by what one sees beyond that. That, for me, has come through Bhante, directly through my contact with him. I remember the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra series, the inconceivable emancipation, when Bhante gave that extraordinary series of talks, and you know, one says something weak like it blew my mind, but it sort of did. It blew me apart. I could see absolutely directly what Bhante meant, what Vimalakirti meant, what the Buddha meant for myself, not just in words. That's what Adhisthana is. That's the Adhisthana that has created this movement through us, but from Bhante. And it's that Adhisthana that it is our duty to pass on to others. Of course, we primarily pass it on by entering into it, if you see what I mean, by opening ourselves up fully to that power emanating, so to speak, from Bhante, from the Buddha, to us. We open ourselves up to it, and we allow it to sustain us with all our intelligence, with all our self-awareness, with all our critical awareness, with all our ethics and so on. But we allow that sustaining power to carry us forward in our work for the movement. And it's really that I want to talk about over these next days, these next 4 days. How do we sustain that Adhisthana that derives ultimately from the Buddha, derives ultimately from, well, the Dhamma. The Buddha, if you remember in the Gādava Sutta, says that he will live revering and relying upon the Dhamma. So if you like, the Dhamma is the primary source of the Adhisthana that the Buddha himself generated and spread. We still are able to receive the Adhisthana of the Buddha even now. If we open up to the Buddha, that Adhisthana will be felt by us as affecting us, opening us up, sustaining us. So yes, that Adhisthana, it's our duty to pass on, to sustain, to enter into, to be sustained by, and thereby to pass it on to others. One element of this, before I go any further, that it's important to stress, the Adhisthana is not a personal experience. When you feel the Adhisthana of the Buddha, or even Bhante, or whatever, you feel as if you're entering into something that transcends personality altogether, not just your personality, but all personality, that is, so to speak, more collective than individual or private or personal. I think this is why it's so important that we keep on stressing this dimension of transcendent experience that transcends the ego. That we don't speak of it too much in terms of personal achievement and attainment, because that by definition denies it. I've just been reading the Diamond Sutra, where what I'm saying is to be found almost in black and white. That if a stream entrant thinks he's a stream entrant, then he's not a stream entrant. It's the Buddha, not me. So the character of this, of Adhisthana, of this suprapersonal force, to use that language, is of a dropping of self, which doesn't mean going into an impersonal blur, but entering into a sense of community with all life, and on many different levels and to many different degrees. To the extent that people themselves experience this, then you enter into Sangha with them. So the character of Adhisthana is to take you beyond yourself. It's interesting, in Indian thinking, there's two terms that are used a little bit coterminously. There's Ashirwad, which we usually translate as blessing, and Adhisthana, which was often also translated as blessing. But my sense is that Ashirwad is more personal. You go for Ashirwad, so that the Guru will, put ashes on your forehead or whatever, kumkum, will sprinkle holy water on you, and your life will be better. You'll get some sort of extra kind of good luck. But Adhisthana is not personal at all. The whole influence of Adhisthana is to transform you so that you want to pass it on. You want to act on its basis to move towards others. So this sustaining power, this transcendent, the sense of transcendence, this sense of entering into life itself, not merely your life, is Adhisthana. For us, it sustains our movement, it's created our movement, it's the fundamental force behind our movement. And it's this that ultimately we are functioning upon and trying to transmit. So the question is, how do we do that? Apart from ourselves trying to experience it and enter into it, how do we do it? Well, the best way I've thought of approaching this is to refer to something that Bhante said about his own, his own guruhood, if you like. Not that he would use that term. He's talked about having 4 lineages. Some of you have probably heard this mentioned. He started talking about it last year. He thinking about his own, what he's handing on, he realised he's got 4 lineages. A lineage of teaching, a lineage of practice, a lineage of responsibility, and a lineage of inspiration. So you could say that Bhante's Ashirwad, which is of course the Buddha's Ashirwad, which is the Dhamma's Ashirwad, no, not Ashirwad, sorry, Adhisthana, comes to us down these 4 lineages. They're not absolutely discrete. They're actually sort of 4 aspects of a whole, but that you can trace distinct sort of lines through them. And I want over these next days to sort of explore these 4 in greater depth. I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm waiting for the sustaining power of Bhante's Adhisthana to see what I'm going to say. But let me just briefly introduce them. Lineage of teachings. Well, Bhante's left us a huge body of teachings. I've done my best in conversations with him recently to get some essences from that, but I'm aware that there's so much that's not been done. I'd hoped to have more conversations. I think it's unlikely. There are one or two issues that I'd really like much clearer. I did tell Bhante that there was one issue that I'd like much clearer, and he said he wasn't interested. But we'll see. We'll see what happens later. Yes, so Bhante's left this huge sort of volume of teachings, and they do have a sort of a coherence, even though it's quite hard to see that coherence because they're so various, and they've been given over such an extensive period of time. I've done my best to sort of define how we might look at that in the first paper, Revering and Relying upon the Dhamma. I've looked at Bhante's own critical approach to his own teaching career. And I've tried in the papers to sort of tease out a few key themes, but there's more to be done, and others might take a different slice through it all. But Bhante considers himself to have established for our times. Dhammarati rather unfortunately mentioned wanting to transmit the Dhamma in the Western world. I'm mortally offended. In the modern world, please. A third of our order is in India. And no doubt there will be in China and so forth. So you stand corrected, Chairman of the College. Yes, that is uniquely adapted to the modern world. Very, very interesting. You know that at Bhante's request I published a Buddhist manifesto, and Bhante sent it out to a number of leading Buddhist figures in Britain and Europe. And Dhammarati, I think, gave away copies at a conference of Buddhist teachers. And I won't say that we've had a blizzard of responses, but we've had a significant number of responses from unexpected quarters, wholeheartedly endorsing what I've set out as Bhante's approach, with sometimes minor quibbles, as it were. But on the whole, Bhante got there 50 years before most others. Most others, or many others now, are beginning to realise what is involved in transmitting the Dhamma in the Western world. And they're coming to similar conclusions. But Bhante started right from the start, because he had the great good fortune of being kicked out of the conventional Buddhist world. It was a wonderful thing for us, and Bhante often says that we should have a shrine to Maurice Walsh and as the true founder of the order. Sort of joking apart. But Bhante's approach is uniquely adapted to the circumstances in the modern world. It's very, very striking. You know that I spend 6 months each year in India. I do a lot of teaching in India. That's my main work. And I, of course, work a lot with senior order members in India. And they're always saying how extraordinary Bhante's teaching is, and how if they hadn't come across Bhante's teaching, they could not have really entered into the Dhamma. They were all deeply inspired by Dr. Ambedkar and strongly motivated into the Dhamma by Dr. Ambedkar. They got no route in. They don't know how to put it into effect. They don't know how to practice it. There are expedients. There's some quite lively movements now. Of course, Mr. Goenka is very much alive in India and teaching meditation very ably. But it's not a movement. And it has, frankly, many worrying features for the future after Mr. Goenka himself. One worries what will happen. But there are not really many other expedients for people. And Bhante's approach gives them the tools to to really practice the Dhamma for themselves and realize it, and to communicate it to others. Very simple, clear, based in direct experience, very sensible, and yet very lofty and inspired. It's really very striking, that sense that the Indians have, that they've been given something they could not have got anywhere else. We've got a wider fare here, a wider menu, but still we must not forget what the unique combination that Bhante has given us. And it's that teaching, that unique combination in the teaching, that sustains the order. It's where we all meet, at least in one area, one major area. I'm going to have more to say about that, because of course that cannot be a static phenomenon. It has to itself be capable of responding to changing circumstances, and we need mechanisms for that to take place. I'll have more probably to say if the Adhisthana carries me that way. I've got a wonderful excuse, haven't I? Sorry, no Adhisthana today. Practice is rather similar, really. Bhante's given us a basic body of practices. It's not inelastic and not immune to criticism, but there's a basic alphabet of practice. And again, it's quite important that we honour that, respect that, and at the same time that we find ways of evaluating it, and perhaps, if it's useful, taking in new approaches. So yes, there's teachings and practices closely allied, which we derive from Bhante, and that we need between us to keep alive, and need to find ways of keeping as much in common as we can without belying our particular experience, if you see what I mean. So we need to have a kind of a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue, sorry for the cliche, which sustains that. Then there's responsibility. I'm going to deal with that a bit more fully, because I think I don't need to deal with it again. The lineage of responsibility is very, very interesting. In reflecting on this, I thought that if you think of responsibility as a lineage, it changes your perspective. Have you read the accounts, I'm sure, of the first ordinations, where Bhante quotes from his diary? He went with the shrine gear to the hall where the ordinations were going to take place. He set up the shrine, arranged the flowers, set out the candles, put out the incense, then got the teacups out of the cupboard, made the tea, welcomed everybody, and then conducted the ordinations. And then when the ordinations were over, he washed up the cups, put them away, flushed the tea down the sink. I'm sure he didn't do that, because that would be blocking the sink, but he put it in the waste bin, took the shrine down and went home. Bhante did it all. All responsibility was with him. And for the first years of the order, that was very much the case. Even when I first began to get involved, it was pretty much like that, although with the very beginnings of order members taking some responsibility. The first classes I went to were led by Bhante, but after a little while I went down to the classes, and there was Paul and Christine leading the classes. Anybody remember Paul and Christine? Nobody. Oh, yeah, Dhammadina's there. Phew. Paul and Christine. Paul, of course, is Dhammapala, who left the order for a while and came back. Christine was Karuna, who unfortunately left and has not come back. They led the class. And that was the first time that had happened, apparently. And in fact, on the first retreat that I went on, where I met Dhammadina, Bhante got very ill after the first day, and the retreat was led by order members. I think I wasn't really aware what an order member was, and frankly, when I did become aware, I didn't think very much of it. Arrogant little brat. But Bhante slowly shared his responsibilities. Some of his responsibilities he, as it were, shared with the entire order. He shared responsibility, you could say, for the running of centres. He handed that on to order members running centres, and he handed to them responsibility for electing their chair, for appointing their mitra convener, and so on. Initially, he'd done all that. Bhante was the mitra convener. I wasn't actually a mitra because mitras hadn't been invented in those days. I think Kamalashila was amongst the first mitras, maybe the first. And Bhante conducted the mitra ceremony, I remember that. They were Kalyana mitra ceremonies, in fact. But Bhante, yes, Bhante was the contact for everybody. He was the one who gave Kalyana Mitrata. Incidentally, Kalyana could be a translation of Adhisthana or a synonym for Adhisthana. Quite interesting possibility. So yes, Bhante was not just chief Kalyana Mitra, he was the Kalyana Mitra. Slowly others began to take that up. Order convening. Well, Bhante led the first order chapters. He did study on the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. He did study on the Bodhicharya Avatara in the chapter, I believe. I wasn't in it at that time. They were discussing my ordination, which I was absolutely disgusted to hear. Who were they to just talk about me? You can get what a young brat I was. Don't say it. I've changed. But yeah, Bhante was order convener, mitra convener. But slowly he handed these things on. For many years, Bhante continued to do all ordinations until really 1990. Although Kamalashila, myself and Suvadra did ordinations in India, and Padmashuri and Srimala and Ratnashuri did ordinations in India the following year. We did it on Bhante's authority, if you see what I mean. I must say that was a handhold I was very grateful for. But in 1990, Bhante definitively handed it on to the public preceptors. And we didn't even check with him the people to be ordained. He didn't know them. That responsibility too was handed on. And Bhante gradually handed on all his responsibilities. In 2000, he spoke of handing on his responsibilities, his final responsibilities as head of the order. In a way, I think there were more responsibilities to be handed on, and I think that's what's been happening over the last 4 or 5 years. I myself trust that the process is complete, although I'm sure that Bhante could hand on more if he's so inclined. Responsibility within the order has been a slow process of Bhante handing it on. In my acceptance talk at the Bhante's birthday in 2000, I rather unfortunately talked of handing over. I got my wrist slapped for that, because Bhante said that missed the character of it. It was a handing on, not a handing over. In other words, a sharing, rather than something that was given. But Bhante gradually shared his responsibilities, some to the whole order, and through the whole order to particular individuals, some to particular individuals who were responsible for conducting ordinations both publicly and privately. So we've got some responsibilities that, so to speak, ascend from the whole order, and some responsibilities that, so to speak, descend from Bhante. Although we've built into the system the possibility of advice, consultation from the whole order, even in those appointments. So those responsibilities have been handed on. And I find it very useful to think that the responsibilities I hold, for instance, a public preceptor, as a president, as an order member, I hold as it were, because they've been handed to me by Bhante, and that I hold them in the way that Bhante held them. I try to hold them in the way that Bhante held them. They come to me from him. He created those responsibilities. Of course, they've evolved since his day, and they involve so much more than they would have done in his time often. And, well, they're much more collectively held. But, yes, those responsibilities fundamentally in their essence are the same responsibilities as he held. And that you could say he derived from, well, wherever he derived them. That's the extraordinary majesty of Bhante, that he had to unfold those responsibilities from within himself without really having been given them by anybody else on this plane. So yes, that's the lineage of responsibility. We are all here, by definition, in this lineage of responsibility. You could even say this is a meeting of some of the key holders of the lineage of responsibility. I don't know what that does for you, but that certainly sharpens my awareness of what I'm doing. And then there's the lineage of inspiration. And of course, this is the one that's really most appealing and the one that's most indefinable. You remember at the end of the What is the Order conversations, Bhante said something like, we should be careful not to think that it can all be pinned down. He said that in the end there's something indefinable about me and indefinable about the order and the movement that cannot really be put into a system or defined in words, and that without that indefinable something, all the other things, the teachings, the practices, the responsibilities, are, well, in the end, you'd have to say, worthless. They're only useful insofar as they are animated by this lineage of responsibility, which is not something that is easy to catch. It's something that we're all involved in deciding whether people are ready for ordination or not. And you know those excruciating discussions where you've got people who are doing all the right things and yet you know they're not ready. And then there are people who are doing all the wrong things and you know that they are ready. Because the indefinable something, the indefinable inspiration, the spark of the transcendental that Bhante speaks of, us needing to look for, is either not there or there. And that really goes for everything. And part of our responsibility is towards that lineage of inspiration. Part of our responsibility is to keep that inspiration alive in our own centres, in our own chapters, amongst our mitras, in the ordination process and the selection of people for ordination, etc. That's part of our responsibility, is to stand back from the particularities of responsibility, the detail, the workaday job of it, and look to the indefinable something that can never, ever be finally decided upon or defined. And that's a light in the eyes, a spring in the step, a mood or atmosphere, whether individually experienced or collectively experienced, tongue of fire that is felt but can't be captured, can't be caught, and that emerges out of our own opening up to Adhisthana, the Adhisthana of Bhante, the Adhisthana even of our own Kalyanamittras and teachers, the Adhisthana of the Buddha, the Adhisthana of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And the more we open up to that Adhisthana, the more that lineage of inspiration will live. Very aware of this, doing my sadhana. I've been recently reanimating my Manjushri Stuti sadhana. I'd done other practices for a while, but I've been going back to that. And I started to say something. I don't know how to say it. But something that in the practice, which is not what I do, it comes from beyond that. Officially, the practice is at the level of Kriya Yoga. It's at the level of, sort of ritual enactment. But the samadhi that follows the practice is at the level of Ati Yoga. So that you get something, so to speak, that you haven't worked for. That's inspiration. That's the Dhamma Niyama processes, where more leads to greater still, rather than the reactive processes where more leads to less, leads to more, leads to less, if you see what I mean. But in real Dhamma practice, when you do open up to Adhisthana, whether it comes from Manjushri, whether it comes from Bhante, whether it comes from your friends, whether it comes from reading the Dhamma, whether it comes in a completely inexplicable moment, that Adhisthana carries you beyond yourself and is the spark of inspiration. And that is what we, as the holders, the principal holders of the lineage of responsibility, are ultimately responsible for, and that needs to animate everything we're engaged with. I remember Bhante at one of the first chairs meetings. They were chairman's meetings in those days, not just for incorrect reasons, but because they were all men. But in those days. Bhante went through with us the precepts of the gurus, and out of that he drew some really, really important points. Those are still quite important seminars, I think. Strongly recommend going back to them. But one of the points he made to us very strongly was, guard your sources of inspiration. When you're holding responsibility, it's very easy for the responsibility to swamp inspiration. All you're doing is the work a day. You're not in contact with the inspiring force that makes it all possible, makes it all what it should be. So it's very important for us to be part of that lineage of inspiration, that certain indefinable something that runs all the way through the movement, and that is strangely the same wherever you go. I'm most aware of it in the UK and in India. I haven't been visiting other places for quite a while. Oh, Holland, Netherlands. But when you go to these different places, you go to these different centres, you sort of feel you're in the same Dhamma world. There's some flavour that is the same. Particularly striking where India is concerned, because there's so much that's different, but there's so much that's the same. So something so deep, so fundamental, which is partly to do with the practices we do, the teachings that we follow, but more than anything, the system that we have, but more than anything, it's to do with this indefinable essence of inspiration that is a particular flavour coming from Bhante's Ashirwad, coming from wherever that Ashirwad came from. Ashirwad, no, Adhisthana. I think that'll do for tonight. I've tried to set a scene. I've tried to evoke the spirit of Adhisthana, because after all we're here. And Bhante gave that name clearly, very deliberately. Just a little while ago, just before he chose that name, he asked me to read him a passage from the Diamond Sutra. I've been trying to find a copy of the Diamond Sutra, but I'm ashamed to say there isn't one in the house. I don't know what that means. At least the Konza version. I'm sure they've got other ones. But in the Konza version, there's a passage where the Buddha is talking about the the Bodhisattva and their ability to communicate the Dhamma. And he talks of them, he asks the question, how? Why can they do this? And the answer that's given in Konza's translation is because an absolute exalts the holy persons. Don't get reactive about the language. Absolute, of course, what's meant here is absolute in the sense of something beyond the merely conditioned. Something beyond the worldly, the samsaric. An absolute means something transcendent, transcending ego identity and an egoistic interpretation of our experience, which is what we inevitably do. So an absolute exalts the holy persons. The holy persons is obviously the Arya Pudgala, the stream entrant, once returner, non-returner, and Arahat. But exalts, I can't remember the word that is used here. That's why I was trying to find the copy. If I find it, I'll mention it. But Konza says that exalts isn't quite right because, but there isn't really an adequate word for it. It's got something of the meaning of sustaining, something of the meaning of carrying up, something of the meaning of a power that supports and directs even. But they are able to be bodhisattvas. They're able to carry out their bodhisattva activity because they're exalted by an absolute. They're sustained by Adhisthana. They're sustained by a suprapersonal force, whatever language you want to use. They're sustained by Dhamma Niyama processes. They're sustained by Buddhas and Bodhisattvas arising within those Dhamma Niyama processes. They're sustained by something beyond self. And that exalts them. That turns ordinary beings into bodhisattvas. And that's what we need to be. That's what we need to do. That's what, to some extent, we are. That's what, to some extent, we do. I'm more and more confident of that within our order, that there is this sustaining power, this Adhisthana, alive amongst so many of us and shared by so many of us. Thank you.